Welcome. This video introduces the Python programming language. In CS111 we're using Python 3, not Python 2. Lab 0 on the course website has information about how to install it, so make sure you do that if you haven't already. Now once you have it installed, one way to use Python is to interact with the Python shell. And I've already opened up the shell here on my own machine. And you can see that there's this prompt that shows up. It contains 3 greater than symbols. And that's how Python indicates that it's waiting for you to type something in. Now one thing you can do with the shell is arithmetic. So for example, you can make use of these operators that are listed here. Most of them are pretty straightforward. It's worth noting that multiplication is done using an asterisk. So 6 times 7 gives me 42. And you can see I can just put that expression and hit enter and it shows me the result. 2 asterisks give me exponentiation. So here I can compute 2 to the 4th, or 16. And then the other one that you may not have seen before is the modulus or mod operator. We use the percent sign for that, and it gives us the remainder of a division. So for example, 17 mod 2, 2 goes into 17 8 times with a remainder of 1. So we get a 1 there. If I do 17 mod 3, 3 goes into 17 5 times with a remainder of 2. Now it's important to realize that the operators follow the standard order of operations, the ones you may have seen from high school algebra. For example, multiplication gets done before addition. So if I type in 2 plus 3 times 5, the multiplication is going to get done first, and I end up with 17. If you need to change the order of operations, you can use parentheses. So if I put parentheses around the addition, it will get done first, and I'll get 25. Now it turns out that there are different what are called data types in Python, and this is true in all languages because different kinds of values are stored differently in the computer's memory, and they're also operated on differently. In Python there are 2 main types for numbers. There's an integer type, and there's a separate type for numbers that include a decimal, and those are called floating point numbers or floats. Now it turns out that each data type has its own set of operators. So there are really 2 sets of numeric operators, one for integers or ints and one for floating point numbers or floats. And the way that Python determines which one to use, which operator to use, is based on these rules. If at least one of the operands is a float, the result will be a float because we're using the float operator. But if both of the operands are ints, the result will be an int because we're using the int version of the operator. So for example, if I do 3 plus 7.0, because the 7.0 is a float, it has a decimal, I'm going to use the float addition operator and I get a float result. But if I use 2 ints, I get an int result. Now that's typically how things work, but there's one really important exception, and that is division. It turns out that if I use the single slash division operator, I'm always going to get a float, regardless of the types of the numbers that I'm dividing. So for example, if I do 5/3, I get this as the result. And that's a good thing because I need a float here to fully capture the result. But notice what happens if I do 6 divided by 3. Ordinarily we would think of that as being an integer result, but I get 2.0. So you always get a float if you use the single slash division operator. Now there is a separate double slash operator for what is called integer division. And here I'm always going to get an int as the result. So now if I do 6/3, I get 2 with no decimal. So here I'm using integer division, no decimal in the result. And this will happen even if we would ordinarily get a fractional part in regular mathematics. So for example, 11/5 gives me 2, not 2.2. So I'm discarding whatever comes after the decimal. 5/3 is going to give me 1. So again, we're throwing away what comes after the decimal. And it's important to realize here that it does not round, right? If it did, 5//3, which is 1.66666, would give me 2. But I'm not getting 2, I'm getting 1, because we're not rounding, we're truncating. And then there's one more type I want to briefly mention. It's the string type. A string in computer science is a sequence of characters or other kinds of symbols. It's used for text in your program. And when we put a string into our code, we need to surround it by either double quotes or single quotes. And I've given you an example of each variation here. It doesn't matter whether you use the double quotes or the single quotes.